What would you do if you were the Supreme Allied Commander responsible for the largest military operation in history, and you received a report that a single soldier had accomplished something that should have taken an entire armored division 3 days to achieve? What would you say if that soldier was a man your own generals had dismissed as a primitive savage? A man who had crossed 60 miles of enemy-occupied territory in a single night, through snow and ice and the deadliest German offensive of the war, arriving at a besieged city hours before the relief force that was supposed to save it. And what would you think if everything you believed about warfare, about human capability, about the limits of what one man could do, was shattered in a single moment by a warrior from the Arizona desert who should not have been able to do what he did? Before we go any further, I need you to do something. Drop a comment right now telling me where you are watching from. What city, what state, what corner of the world, and if you have ever felt that there are heroes whose stories have been deliberately erased from history, if you have ever suspected that the truth about World War II is far stranger than what they taught you in school, then hit that subscribe button. This channel exists to bring the buried stories back to light. Help us keep fighting the darkness of forgotten history. Now let me take you back to December of 1944, back to the frozen forests of Belgium, where the greatest battle of the Western Front was about to begin. Back to a moment that would test the limits of human endurance and reveal abilities that the United States Army would spend the next 80 years trying to understand. The Battle of the Bulge began on December 16th, 1944, when 200,000 German soldiers launched a surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. The attack caught the Allied forces completely off guard. Intelligence had dismissed the possibility of a major German offensive in the region. The terrain was too difficult, the weather was too severe, the German army was too depleted. They were wrong. Within 48 hours, the German advance had created a bulge almost 50 miles deep in the Allied lines. American units were being overrun, encircled, annihilated. Entire divisions were cut off from supply and communication. The road to Antwerp, the vital port that supplied the entire Allied war effort, lay open before the advancing panzers, and in the center of the chaos, surrounded by German forces on all sides, was the small Belgian town of Bastogne. Bastogne was a crossroads. 7 major roads converged there, making it essential for any army moving through the Ardennes. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the movement of troops and supplies across the entire region. The Germans knew this, the Americans knew this, and on December 19th, as the German forces closed in from every direction, the fate of the entire Allied offensive hung in the balance. The defense of Bastogne fell to the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, who had been rushed to the town just ahead of the German advance. They were elite soldiers, among the best in the American army, veterans of Normandy and Market Garden, but they were also exhausted, undersupplied, and vastly outnumbered. They had been told to hold Bastogne until relief arrived. They had not been told how long that would take. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, watched the situation from his headquarters in Versailles with growing alarm. The German offensive threatened to split the Allied armies in two. If Bastogne fell, if the Germans reached Antwerp, the entire war effort could be set back by months or even years. Everything depended on getting reinforcements to that besieged town before it was too late. The problem was distance. The nearest available relief force was General George Patton's Third Army, positioned almost 100 miles to the south. Patton had promised to redirect his forces and reach Bastogne within 3 days. It was an audacious claim, requiring his army to disengage from their current operations, pivot 90 degrees, and advance through enemy-held territory in the worst winter weather Europe had seen in decades. 3 days. 72 hours. That was how long the defenders of Bastogne had to hold. But someone arrived before Patton. Someone arrived before anyone thought possible. Someone whose journey through the frozen hell of the Ardennes would become one of the most classified episodes of the entire war. His name was Joseph Grey-Eagle. He was 26 years old, a member of the White Mountain Apache tribe, born and raised on the Fort Apache Reservation in Arizona. He had enlisted in the Army in 1942, the same week his younger brother had been killed at Guadalcanal. He had served with distinction in North Africa and Italy before being transferred to a special unit attached to the Office of Strategic Services. The unit was designated Detachment 12. Officially, it did not exist. Detachment 12 was composed entirely of Native American soldiers drawn from tribes across the United States: Apache, Navajo, Comanche, Lakota, Cherokee. They had been selected for a single purpose: to serve as scouts and pathfinders in terrain where conventional reconnaissance was impossible. They had been trained in techniques that combined traditional indigenous tracking methods with modern military tactics, and they had developed abilities that their commanding officers could not explain and did not fully understand. Joseph Grey-Eagle was the best of them. The personnel file that survived the post-war purges described him as possessing an almost supernatural awareness of his environment. He could track enemy movements through terrain that left no visible traces. He could navigate through forests and mountains without maps or compass, guided by senses that seemed to perceive things invisible to ordinary soldiers. He could move through hostile territory like a ghost, unseen and unheard, covering distances that should have taken days in a matter of hours. His commanding officer, a colonel named William Harrington, had written in an evaluation that Grey-Eagle represents either the most remarkable scout in the history of the United States Army or something else entirely that I am not qualified to categorize. On December 19, 1944, as the German offensive reached its peak, Detachment 12 received orders directly from Eisenhower's headquarters. A critical message had to reach the defenders of Bastogne. Radio communication had been compromised. The roads were blocked by German forces. Airdrops were impossible due to the weather. The message had to be delivered by hand, by a soldier capable of crossing 60 miles of enemy-occupied territory in conditions that would kill an ordinary man. The mission was considered suicidal. The survival probability was estimated at less than 5%, but the message was essential. It contained information about German positions, ammunition drops, and most importantly, the exact timing of Patton's relief assault. Without that information, the defenders of Bastogne would be fighting blind. Colonel Harrington called Grey-Eagle into his command post and explained the situation. He did not order him to go. He could not order a man to die. He simply laid out the facts and asked if Grey-Eagle was willing to try. Grey-Eagle listened in silence. When Harrington finished, the Apache scout asked only one question: "When do I leave?" He departed at 2200 hours on December 19th. The temperature was 14 degrees below zero. Snow was falling heavily, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet. The German lines were less than 3 miles away, and between those lines and Bastogne lay 60 miles of frozen forest, armored patrols, artillery positions, and over 100,000 enemy soldiers. No one expected to see him again. What happened over the next 18 hours would become the subject of classified reports, scientific investigations, and heated debates that continue to this day. The official record is fragmentary, pieced together from Grey-Eagle's own testimony, the accounts of soldiers who encountered him along the way, and the physical evidence that could not be explained by any conventional means. The first confirmed sighting came at 0300 hours on December 20th. A patrol from the 28th Infantry Division, one of the units that had been shattered by the initial German assault, was struggling through the forest near the village of Houffalize when they encountered a figure moving through the trees. Private First Class Raymond Morrison, one of the few survivors of that patrol, gave a statement after the war that was immediately classified. "We thought he was a German at first," Morrison said. "He came out of the snow like he had been born from it. No sound, no warning, just suddenly there, standing in front of us. We almost shot him before we saw the American uniform." Morrison described Grey Eagle as moving with an almost inhuman fluidity. He did not seem affected by the cold, despite wearing only standard-issue winter gear. His eyes, Morrison said, were the strangest thing. They seemed to see everything at once, like he was looking at us and through us and at something else entirely, all at the same time. Grey Eagle asked the patrol for their position and the location of the nearest German units. The information he provided in return saved their lives. He told them about a German armored column that was approaching from the northwest, a column that the patrol had no way of knowing about. He told them the exact route to take to avoid it. He told them where to find an American position where they could take shelter. Then he disappeared back into the snow. The patrol followed his instructions. Every detail was accurate. The German column passed within 200 meters of where they had been standing, less than 20 minutes after Grey Eagle had warned them. If they had not moved, they would all be dead. Morrison asked the intelligence officer who debriefed him how Grey Eagle could have known about the column. The column was miles away. There was no radio communication. There was no way any human being could have known they were coming. The intelligence officer did not have an answer. The second sighting came at 06:30 hours, as dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. A group of Belgian resistance fighters operating near the village of Neuville encountered an American soldier moving through their sector. They were suspicious at first. German commandos had been infiltrating the area, wearing American uniforms, spreading confusion and terror. They stopped him at gunpoint and demanded identification. The leader of the resistance group, a man named Jacques Delacroix, survived the war and gave an interview in 1978 that was never published. "He did not seem afraid," Delacroix said. "We had guns pointed at his head, and he did not seem afraid at all. He looked at us with these calm, dark eyes, and he spoke to us in perfect French. Not schoolbook French. The French of this region, with the accent of the Ardennes. I do not know how an American Indian from Arizona learned to speak French like a Belgian farmer, but he did." Grey Eagle provided information about German positions that the resistance had not been able to gather. He knew the location of a panzer unit that had been hidden in a barn 2 kilometers away. He knew the timing of German patrols along the main road. He knew things, Delacroix said, that we had been trying to learn for 3 days. In exchange, the resistance provided Grey Eagle with food and directions. They offered to guide him through their territory. He refused. He said he could move faster alone. Faster was an understatement. The distance from Neuville to Bastogne is approximately 8 miles as the crow flies. Through the forest in deep snow, with German forces everywhere, it should have taken a full day to cover that ground safely. Grey Eagle covered it in less than 2 hours. He arrived at the American perimeter around Bastogne at 08:45 on December 20th. The sentries who first spotted him nearly shot him, so unexpected was his appearance. He emerged from the tree line like an apparition, covered in snow, his breath steaming in the frozen air, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made hardened combat veterans take a step back. He demanded to be taken to General Anthony McAuliffe, the commander of the Bastogne garrison. When asked who he was, he gave his name, rank, and unit designation. The sentries had never heard of Detachment 12. They thought he was a German spy. It took almost 30 minutes to verify his identity. During that time, Grey Eagle stood perfectly still in the freezing cold, showing no sign of exhaustion, no indication that he had just completed one of the most remarkable journeys in military history. When he was finally cleared and brought before General McAuliffe, the first thing he did was hand over the message he had been carrying. The second thing he did was tell McAuliffe exactly where the German forces were positioned, not approximately, not based on intelligence estimates. Exactly. Every unit, every artillery position, every armor concentration. Information that would have taken aerial reconnaissance and captured prisoners and days of analysis to compile. Grey Eagle delivered it from memory, as if he had personally observed every German soldier in the Ardennes. McAuliffe was astonished. He asked how Grey Eagle had obtained this information. Grey Eagle's answer would later be cited in classified reports as evidence that the Native American scout possessed abilities that defied conventional explanation. "The land told me," he said. "The snow remembers where they have walked. The trees remember where they have camped. The air remembers the smoke of their fires. If you know how to listen, the earth will tell you everything." McAuliffe did not know what to make of this answer. He was a practical soldier, not a mystic. But the information Grey Eagle provided was accurate. Over the following hours, as American reconnaissance confirmed detail after detail, it became clear that the Apache scout had provided the most comprehensive intelligence picture of the German offensive that any commander in the Ardennes had received. The message he had delivered was equally valuable. It contained the exact timing of Patton's attack, allowing McAuliffe to coordinate his defense accordingly. It contained information about air supply drops that would bring desperately needed ammunition and medical supplies. And it contained something else, something that would boost the morale of the exhausted defenders more than any tactical information could. A personal note from General Eisenhower himself. "Hold Bastogne at all costs," Eisenhower had written. "Relief is coming. The eyes of the world are upon you. Make them proud." McAuliffe would become famous for his response to a German surrender demand that arrived on December 22nd. When the German commander asked for the honorable surrender of the American forces, McAuliffe replied with a single word: nuts. But what the history books do not record is that McAuliffe's confidence, his willingness to reject the surrender demand, was based in large part on the information Joseph Grey Eagle had brought him. He knew exactly how strong the German forces were. He knew exactly when Patton would arrive. He knew he could hold, and he held. Against overwhelming odds, against constant assault, against the worst that the German army could throw at him, the defenders of Bastogne held until Patton's 4th Armoured Division broke through on December 26th. But by then, Joseph Grey Eagle was gone. He had not stayed in Bastogne to enjoy the safety of the perimeter. He had not rested after his impossible journey. Within hours of delivering his message, he had requested permission to return to the field. There were other units cut off behind German lines. There were other soldiers who needed help. He could find them. He could guide them to safety. He could do what no one else could do. McAuliffe tried to refuse. The man had just crossed 60 miles of enemy territory in less than 12 hours. He needed rest. He needed medical evaluation. He needed to explain how he had done what he had done. Grey Eagle listened politely. Then he said something that McAuliffe would remember for the rest of his life. "General, with respect, my people have been walking these distances for longer than your country has existed. This is not remarkable to us. This is simply what we do. And there are men out there who will die tonight if I do not reach them. Please do not ask me to rest while they are dying." McAuliffe looked at the young Apache warrior, standing straight and calm despite everything he had endured, his eyes already focused on something beyond the walls of the command post, beyond the siege lines, beyond the frozen forests where so many Americans were still fighting and dying. The general was not a sentimental man. He had sent thousands of soldiers to their deaths and would send thousands more before the war was over. But something in Grey Eagle's eyes, something in his absolute conviction, moved McAuliffe in a way he could not explain. He granted permission. Joseph Grey Eagle walked back into the frozen night, disappearing into the snow like a ghost, heading toward the German lines and whatever lay beyond them. He would save 47 American soldiers over the next 3 days, guiding lost units through enemy territory, providing intelligence that prevented ambushes, appearing and disappearing like a spirit of the forest. The soldiers he rescued would tell stories about him for the rest of their lives. Stories that grew more incredible with each retelling, but that never quite captured the reality of what they had witnessed. And then, on December 23rd, he vanished, not killed, not captured, simply gone. One moment he was with a group of soldiers he was guiding toward American lines. The next moment he was not. He had stepped behind a tree, they said, and never emerged on the other side. They searched for him. They called his name. They found nothing, not even footprints in the snow. Joseph Grey-Eagle was officially listed as missing in action on December 24, 1944. His body was never recovered. His fate was never determined. He simply ceased to exist as mysteriously as he had appeared. But the story does not end there. The story, in fact, was just beginning. 3 weeks after the siege of Bastogne was lifted, after the German offensive had been turned back, after the immediate crisis had passed, a message arrived at Eisenhower's headquarters from a source that was never identified. The message was brief. It contained only 2 sentences. The scout who reached Bastogne has returned to his people. He fulfilled the purpose for which he was sent. Eisenhower demanded an explanation. Who had sent this message? What did it mean? Where was Grey-Eagle now? No explanation was ever provided. The investigation that followed turned up nothing. The message had arrived through official military channels, but no one could identify its origin. It was as if it had materialized from thin air. Eisenhower was not a man who believed in mysteries. He was a soldier, a planner, a master of logistics and strategy. But what had happened at Bastogne, what Joseph Grey-Eagle had done, defied everything he thought he knew about warfare. He made a note in his personal diary on January 15, 1945. That diary entry would remain classified until 2004. "I have commanded millions of men," Eisenhower wrote. "I have planned operations that changed the course of history. I believed I understood what human beings were capable of. And then I received the reports about what happened at Bastogne, about the Apache who crossed 60 miles of enemy territory in a single night, about the intelligence he provided that should have been impossible to obtain, about his disappearance, which defies all rational explanation." The diary entry continued. "I asked Colonel Harrington to explain how his scout accomplished these things. Harrington could not explain it. He said that Grey-Eagle and the others in his unit possessed abilities that came from their traditional training, from knowledge passed down through generations. He said that the army had been trying to study these abilities for years without success. He said that some things cannot be understood by men who have forgotten how to listen to the earth." Eisenhower had written those final words with evident frustration. "I do not know what to make of this," he concluded. "I am a modern man. I believe in science and reason and the quantifiable factors that determine victory or defeat. But I saw the evidence. I read the reports. Something happened at Bastogne that I cannot explain. And I am beginning to suspect that there are truths about this world, about human capability, about the nature of reality itself, that our civilization has lost, and that men like Joseph Grey-Eagle still remember." The entry ended with a single question, written in a heavier hand, as if Eisenhower had pressed down harder on his pen. What else have we forgotten? The question Eisenhower asked in his diary would haunt the American military establishment for decades. What had Joseph Grey-Eagle done? How had he done it? And could whatever abilities he possessed be understood, replicated, and weaponized for future conflicts? The investigation began in February of 1945, while the war was still raging across Europe. A special team was assembled under the command of Colonel Marcus Webb, an intelligence officer who had previously worked on the Manhattan Project before being transferred to what was designated Operation Ghostwalker. Webb's orders were simple: find out everything about Detachment 12, understand how their scouts accomplished what they accomplished, and determine whether these abilities could be trained into conventional soldiers. The investigation would consume 6 years, generate over 3,000 pages of classified reports, and ultimately conclude with findings so disturbing that the entire project was buried under the highest security classification available. Webb began by interviewing the surviving members of Detachment 12. Of the 37 Native American scouts who had served in the unit, 23 had been killed in action, 7 had been wounded too severely to continue service, and 7 remained active. Of those 7, only 3 were willing to speak about their experiences. The first was a Comanche named Robert Whitehorse, who had served as a scout in the Pacific Theater before being transferred to Europe. Whitehorse was cautious, speaking in generalities, clearly uncomfortable discussing the deeper aspects of his training. But he confirmed that the members of Detachment 12 had been selected based on abilities that went beyond conventional military skills. "We were chosen because we could see things others could not," Whitehorse said. "Not with our eyes, with something else, something that has no name in English. My grandfather called it the inner sight, the ability to perceive the world as it truly is, not as it appears to be." Webb pressed for specifics. What did inner sight allow them to do? Whitehorse was silent for a long moment. "It allowed us to be where we needed to be," he said finally, "to know things we should not know, to move through spaces that should have been impassable. The land speaks to those who know how to listen, and we were trained from childhood to listen." The second scout willing to speak was a Lakota named James Standing Bear. He had served with Grey Eagle in Italy and had been one of the last people to see him before his disappearance at Bastogne. Standing Bear's account was more detailed than Whitehorse's. He described a training regimen that began in early childhood, passed down through generations of warriors and medicine men. The training involved fasting, meditation, exposure to extreme conditions, and rituals that Standing Bear refused to describe in detail. "We learned to separate ourselves from our bodies," Standing Bear explained. "Not completely, not permanently, but enough to perceive things that the physical senses could not detect. Joseph was better at this than anyone I ever knew. He could send his awareness miles ahead of his body, scouting terrain, locating enemies, finding paths that no one else could see." Webb was skeptical. What Standing Bear was describing sounded like astral projection, a concept from occult traditions that the army had no interest in endorsing. He asked for proof. Standing Bear smiled. "You want proof? Look at what Joseph did at Bastogne. 60 miles through enemy territory in 12 hours. Perfect intelligence on German positions he could not have observed physically, appearing and disappearing like a ghost. That is your proof. The question is whether you are willing to believe what your own eyes are showing you." Webb could not dismiss the evidence. The reports from Bastogne were clear. Grey Eagle had accomplished something that conventional military analysis could not explain. Multiple witnesses had confirmed his journey. The intelligence he provided had been accurate in every detail. His subsequent rescue of 47 soldiers was documented by the soldiers themselves. Something had happened. The only question was what. The third scout who agreed to speak was a Cherokee named William Blackwood, who had served as second in command of Detachment 12. Blackwood was older than the others, nearly 40, and he approached the interview with a gravity that suggested he had thought carefully about what he was willing to reveal. "You want to understand what we could do," Blackwood said, "but you are asking the wrong question. The question is not what we could do. The question is what all human beings can do if they are properly trained." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Your civilization has forgotten something essential," he continued. "You have built machines to do what your ancestors did with their minds. You have created technologies to perceive what your great-grandparents perceived naturally. You have become so dependent on external tools that you have forgotten the tools within you. Blackwood described a worldview radically different from the materialist assumptions of Western science. In this worldview, consciousness was not confined to the brain. It was a field extending beyond the body, capable of perceiving and interacting with the physical world at distances that seemed impossible. The human being was not separate from the environment, but connected to it in ways that industrial civilization had forgotten. Joseph did not walk 60 miles to Bastogne, Blackwood said. His body walked 60 miles, but his awareness had already been there. He had scouted every foot of that terrain before his feet touched it. He knew where the Germans were because he had already seen them. He knew the safe paths because he had already walked them. His body was simply catching up with where his mind had already gone. Webb asked if this ability could be taught to ordinary soldiers. Blackwood shook his head. "It takes years of training," he said. "Beginning in childhood, the pathways in the mind must be opened before they close. By the time your soldiers reach adulthood, those pathways are sealed. They have been taught since birth that such things are impossible, and belief shapes perception. A man who believes he cannot see will not see, even if his eyes are open." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "There is another problem," he added. "The training is dangerous. It requires disconnecting from the ordinary world in ways that can be harmful. Some who attempt it lose themselves. They become unable to distinguish between physical reality and the other reality they have learned to perceive. They go mad. Some of them die." Webb asked what percentage of trainees failed. Blackwood's answer was sobering. "Among my people, perhaps 1 in 20 successfully completes the training," he said. "The rest either cannot achieve the state or are damaged by the attempt. And those numbers assume training from early childhood, with proper guidance, with the cultural context that makes the experience meaningful. For your soldiers, starting as adults, without that context, I would expect the failure rate to be almost total." Despite these warnings, Operation Ghostwalker proceeded. The potential military applications were too significant to ignore. A soldier who could scout enemy positions without physically being there. A messenger who could traverse impossible distances in impossible times. An intelligence gatherer who could know things without conventional observation. These capabilities, if they could be developed, would revolutionize warfare. Over the next 5 years, the Army attempted to train conventional soldiers in the techniques that Blackwood and the others described. They recruited psychologists, anthropologists, even practitioners of Eastern meditation traditions. They established training facilities in remote locations across the American West. They spent millions of dollars and countless man-hours trying to replicate what the Native American scouts had demonstrated. They failed. Of the 217 soldiers who participated in Operation Ghostwalker training programs between 1945 and 1950, none achieved the abilities that Grey Eagle and his comrades had displayed. Some showed marginal improvement in situational awareness or intuitive decision-making. Some claimed to have experiences that might have been related to the inner sight, but none of them could scout enemy positions from miles away. None of them could traverse impossible distances. None of them could do what Joseph Grey Eagle had done at Bastogne. Worse, the training proved harmful to many participants. 12 soldiers were hospitalized with psychological breakdowns. 3 committed suicide. 19 others were discharged with permanent disability ratings related to mental health issues. The techniques that had produced remarkable abilities in Native American scouts seemed to produce only damage in men who lacked the cultural foundation to support them. In 1951, Operation Ghostwalker was officially terminated. The files were classified at the highest level, the surviving participants were sworn to secrecy, and the remarkable abilities of Detachment 12 were consigned to the dustbin of military history. But the story did not end there. In 1953, a researcher named Dr. Eleanor Hartley was reviewing classified files at the Pentagon when she came across the Ghostwalker documentation. Hartley was a psychologist who had been studying unusual mental abilities in military personnel, and the reports about Joseph Grey immediately captured her attention. She began a new investigation, approaching the subject from a different angle. Instead of trying to train soldiers in abilities they had never possessed, she would study the Native American communities where these abilities still existed. She would document the training methods. She would identify the cultural factors that made the training possible. And she would attempt to understand, at a scientific level, what was actually happening when a scout like Grey Eagle entered the state that Blackwood had called inner sight. Her research took her to reservations across the American Southwest. She spent months among the Apache, the Navajo, the Hopi, learning their traditions, gaining their trust, documenting practices that had never been shared with outsiders. She was not trying to steal their knowledge or weaponize their abilities. She simply wanted to understand. What she discovered was both fascinating and troubling. The abilities demonstrated by men like Grey Eagle were real. They had been practiced by indigenous peoples across the Americas for thousands of years. They were based on a sophisticated understanding of consciousness and its relationship to the physical world, an understanding that Western science was only beginning to approach. But they came with a cost. The training was grueling. It required years of dedication. It demanded that practitioners give up many of the comforts and distractions that ordinary people took for granted, and it changed them in ways that were not always beneficial. Many of the most powerful practitioners were solitary figures, unable to maintain normal relationships, haunted by perceptions that set them apart from ordinary humanity. Hartley interviewed one elderly Apache medicine man who had known Joseph Grey Eagle as a child. The old man, whose name was never recorded in Hartley's reports, spoke about Grey Eagle with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "He was the most gifted student I ever trained," the medicine man said. "The inner sight came to him naturally, like breathing. By the time he was 12, he could perceive things that took other students decades to learn. He could send his awareness across valleys, through mountains, into places where his body had never been." Hartley asked what had happened to Grey Eagle after his disappearance at Bastogne. The old man was silent for a long time. "He came home," he finally said. "Not in body. His body is still out there, somewhere in those frozen forests. But his spirit returned to us. He fulfilled his purpose. He did what he was meant to do. And when it was finished, he let go of the physical and returned to the place where all warriors eventually go." Hartley pressed for clarification. Was Grey Eagle dead? The old man smiled, but his eyes were sad. "Your language does not have words for what Joseph became," he said. "Dead is not accurate. Alive is not accurate. He exists in a state that your science does not recognize. He walks between worlds, neither fully in this one nor fully departed from it. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, those of us who were trained can still feel him, still hear his voice on the wind. He is watching over his people as he always did." Hartley's report, submitted in 1955, recommended a fundamental shift in how the military approached the question of enhanced human perception. Instead of trying to replicate Native American abilities in conventional soldiers, she suggested that the military establish a permanent relationship with the tribes that possessed these traditions. Instead of extraction and weaponization, she proposed partnership and respect. Her recommendations were ignored. The military continued its efforts to develop enhanced perception through technological means. Project M-Cultra, which began in 1953, explored chemical and psychological methods for expanding human consciousness. Project Scanate, which began in 1972, studied remote viewing and other forms of psychic perception. Millions of dollars were spent. Decades of research were conducted, and results were achieved that remain classified to this day. But none of it matched what Joseph Grey Eagle had done on that frozen December night in 1944. None of it captured the effortless mastery that he had displayed. None of it understood the fundamental truth that William Blackwood had tried to explain. The abilities were not techniques to be learned. They were ways of being that emerged from a lifetime of cultural immersion, spiritual discipline, and connection to forces that Western civilization had forgotten. In 2004, when Eisenhower's classified diary entries were finally released, a new generation discovered the story of the Apache warrior who had reached Bastogne before the entire relief division. Historians attempted to piece together what had happened. Researchers dug through archives looking for evidence. Veterans' families shared stories that had been passed down through generations, and on the Fort Apache reservation in Arizona, the descendants of Joseph Grey-Eagle gathered to honor his memory. His great-nephew, a man named Michael Grey-Eagle, spoke at the ceremony. "My great-uncle was not a superhuman," Michael said. "He was a man who remembered what all human beings once knew. He was trained in traditions that connected him to the land, to the spirits, to the web of life that binds all things together. He used those abilities to serve his country, even though his country had done terrible things to his people." Michael paused, looking out over the assembled crowd. "The army spent decades trying to understand what he could do," he continued. "They failed because they were asking the wrong questions. They wanted to know how to replicate his abilities without understanding why those abilities existed. They wanted the power without the responsibility, the knowledge without the wisdom, the gifts without the sacrifice." He shook his head slowly. "That is not how it works. The inner sight is not a technology. It is a relationship with the earth, with the ancestors, with the Creator who made all things. You cannot have the fruits without nurturing the tree. You cannot access these abilities without transforming yourself into the kind of person who can hold them responsibly." The ceremony concluded with a traditional Apache prayer, sung in the language of Grey-Eagle's ancestors. The words rose into the clear Arizona sky, carried on the wind that had witnessed so much history, so much suffering, so much resilience. And perhaps, if you listened very carefully, you could hear another voice joining the song, a voice from beyond the veil, a voice that had walked 60 miles through a frozen hell to save men he had never met. A voice that still watched over his people, still guided those who knew how to listen. Joseph Grey-Eagle never received the recognition he deserved. His name does not appear in the history books. His face does not hang in the halls of military honor. His story was classified, suppressed, forgotten by a government that did not know what to do with truths it could not explain. But among his people, he is remembered. Among those who understand what he sacrificed, he is honored. And among those who still practice the old ways, who still train in the traditions that gave him his remarkable abilities, he is a beacon, a reminder of what is possible when a human being remembers who they truly are. The question that Eisenhower asked in his diary remains as relevant today as it was in 1945. What have we forgotten? What abilities did our ancestors possess that we have lost? What potential lies dormant within us, waiting to be awakened? The answer, according to those who still remember, is more than we can imagine. The human being is not the limited creature that modern civilization believes. We are vast, connected to everything, capable of perceiving and influencing reality in ways that our science has not yet learned to measure. The inner sight is not supernatural, it is natural, part of our birthright as conscious beings. We have simply forgotten how to access it, and that forgetting has cost us dearly. We have forgotten our connection to the earth, and the earth is dying beneath our feet. We have forgotten our connection to each other, and our societies are fragmenting into isolation and fear. We have forgotten our connection to the sacred, and we wander through life without meaning, without purpose, without the guidance that our ancestors took for granted. Joseph Grey-Eagle remembered. In the darkest hour, in the coldest night, when everything seemed lost, he drew upon knowledge that his people had preserved for generations. He became the bridge between worlds, the messenger who crossed impossible distances, the warrior who served something greater than himself. We can remember, too, not overnight, not easily. The pathways that have closed do not open without effort. The connections that have been severed do not mend without sacrifice, but they can be restored. The knowledge is not lost. It waits patient and eternal for those who are willing to seek it. And at the heart of all this knowledge, at the center of every tradition that has preserved these abilities, is a single truth that modern civilization has worked hardest to forget. We are not alone. There is a creator. There is a source from which all things flow. There is a love that underlies the universe, holding it together, guiding it toward purposes that we can barely glimpse. The inner sight, the abilities that men like Grey Eagle demonstrated, these are not human achievements. They are gifts from that source. They are glimpses of a reality that is far vaster, far more beautiful, far more meaningful than the materialist worldview allows. Jesus Christ walked on water. He knew what was in men's hearts before they spoke. He perceived things that no physical sense could detect. He moved through the world with an awareness that transcended ordinary human limitation, and he promised that those who followed him would do even greater things. The abilities of the Native American scouts were not magical, they were spiritual. They emerged from a relationship with the Creator, a relationship that our civilization has largely abandoned. And they point toward a truth that the modern world desperately needs to remember. We are spiritual beings having a physical experience. We are connected to everything and everyone. We are children of a God who loves us beyond measure and who has given us gifts beyond imagination. Joseph Grey Eagle knew this. He lived it. He demonstrated it on that frozen December night when he walked through impossible dangers to deliver a message of hope. We can know it too. We can remember what we have forgotten. We can reconnect with the source that gives us life. We can become, each of us, the bridge between worlds that humanity so desperately needs. The choice is ours. It has always been ours. Eisenhower asked what we have forgotten. The answer is everything that matters. Our connection to the earth, our connection to each other, our connection to the God who created us. But what has been forgotten can be remembered. What has been lost can be found. What has been broken can be healed. The inner sight is still available to those who seek it with pure hearts. The path that Joseph Grey Eagle walked is still open to those willing to follow. The power that carried him through that frozen night still flows through the universe, waiting to be accessed by those who remember how to ask. In the name of Jesus Christ, who conquered death and opened the way to life eternal, may you find the courage to remember. May you find the strength to seek. May you find the faith to believe that you are more than the world has told you. The warriors are watching, the ancestors are waiting, the Creator is calling. All you have to do is listen, just as Joseph Grey Eagle listened on that cold December night. Just as his people have been listening for thousands of years, just as we can all learn to listen again. The snow has long since melted in the forests of the Ardennes. The war has been over for 8 decades. The soldiers who fought at Bastogne have passed into history, but the spirit of Joseph Grey Eagle endures. His courage endures, his sacrifice endures, and the truth he embodied, the truth that human beings are capable of far more than they know, that truth endures most of all. Remember him. Remember what he did. Remember what it means, and may his story awaken something in you that has been sleeping for far too long. The inner sight is calling. The old ways are waiting. The path is open. Walk it. And never forget.